Nancy Rodriguez moved through the Seattle Police Department's evidence processing unit like a ghost, her footsteps barely audible on the polished linoleum floors. At 32, she had perfected the art of occupying space without commanding attention. Her dark hair was perpetually pulled back in a severe bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, and her standard-issue uniform always appeared one size too large, as if she were trying to disappear inside the navy blue fabric. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evidence processing unit occupied the basement level of the precinct, a windowless maze of fluorescent-lit corridors lined with storage lockers, processing stations, and filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. It was here, in this forgotten corner of law enforcement, that Nancy had carved out her existence for the past 4 years. She cataloged seized weapons, processed ballistics evidence, and maintained the department's extensive firearms inventory with meticulous precision that bordered on obsessive. Her workstation sat in the far corner of the main processing room, deliberately positioned where she could see everyone coming but remain largely unseen herself. The desk was immaculate, evidence forms stacked in perfect right angles, pens arranged by color and length, a small digital scale calibrated daily to the nearest hundredth of a gram. Above her monitor, a laminated checklist detailed the 17 steps required for proper evidence chain of custody documentation, each box methodically checked off for every item that crossed her desk. The other officers called her Nervous Nancy behind her back, though never to her face. The nickname had started during her first week, when Detective Mike Patterson had watched her spend 20 minutes triple-checking the serial number on a recovered pistol, her hands visibly trembling as she photographed each angle and documented every microscopic scratch on the weapon's surface. "Jesus Rodriguez," Patterson had muttered to his partner loud enough for half the department to hear, "it's evidence processing, not brain surgery. The gun isn't going to bite you." But Nancy's nervousness wasn't about the weapons themselves. It was about being noticed, about standing out, about anyone looking too closely at the quiet woman who seemed to know an unusual amount about firearms for someone who allegedly spent her days simply cataloging them. She had learned that appearing anxious and uncertain was the perfect camouflage. People dismissed nervous people, overlooked them, forgot they were even in the room. Every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her official shift began, Nancy would arrive at the evidence unit and begin her ritual. She would check each processing station, ensure all equipment was properly calibrated, and review the previous day's intake reports. The routine never varied. Consistency was safety. Predictability was invisibility. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Nancy was processing evidence from a domestic violence arrest when she noticed something that made her pause mid-documentation. The seized weapon, a modified Glock 19, bore subtle alterations that most officers would never detect. The trigger had been professionally lightened, the barrel showed signs of precision rifling work, and the grip had been subtly textured in a pattern she recognized from specialized tactical modifications. She photographed the weapon from 16 different angles, her trained eye cataloging details that wouldn't appear in any standard evidence report. This wasn't a street gun or a typical civilian firearm. This was a weapon that had been customized by someone with serious expertise, the kind of modifications that cost thousands of dollars and required connections to very specialized gunsmiths. Nancy's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she prepared to enter the weapon's description into the evidence database. Protocol dictated that she input only basic information: make, model, serial number, condition. But her instincts, honed through years of training that none of her colleagues knew she possessed, were screaming that this weapon was significant in ways the arresting officers hadn't recognized. She compromised, entering the required basic information while privately noting the advanced modifications in her personal logbook, a detailed record she maintained parallel to the official evidence database. Over the past 4 years, Nancy had filled 3 such logbooks with observations that extended far beyond her official duties. Patterns of weapon modifications, recurring serial number sequences that suggested trafficking networks, ballistics inconsistencies that might indicate professional alteration of evidence. It was information that could have been invaluable to the department's detective bureau, insights that might have connected seemingly unrelated cases, or revealed criminal networks operating under the radar. But sharing such observations would require explaining how a nervous evidence clerk possessed the expertise to make them, and that was a conversation Nancy Rodriguez was not prepared to have. The morning progressed with its usual quiet rhythm. Officer Jennifer Chen dropped off a bag of seized ammunition from a traffic stop, chatting briefly about her weekend plans, while Nancy logged each round with careful precision. Sergeant Williams stopped by to check on a ballistics report, treating Nancy with the casual indifference reserved for administrative personnel, present when needed, invisible otherwise. Around 11 o'clock, Detective Patterson appeared at Nancy's workstation carrying a cardboard box marked with evidence tape and looking unusually frustrated. "Rodriguez," he said, setting the box down with more force than necessary, "I need you to process this ASAP. We've got a court date on Friday, and the defense attorney is claiming chain of custody issues." Nancy nodded without looking up from her current task, a response that Patterson had come to expect from the department's most reliably quiet employee. But as he turned to leave, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Protruding slightly from the evidence box was the distinctive profile of what appeared to be a custom-built sniper rifle scope. Even from her limited angle, Nancy could identify the make and model. A Schmidt & Bender PM2 Ultra Short, a piece of equipment that cost more than most officers made in 2 months, and was favored by military precision marksmen and federal law enforcement snipers. The weapon system this scope was attached to would be capable of surgical precision at distances exceeding 800 meters. In the right hands, it was the kind of equipment that could change the outcome of a standoff, neutralize a threat from positions that standard police marksmen couldn't even attempt. It was also the kind of weapon that shouldn't be turning up as evidence in routine Seattle Police Department cases. Nancy's pulse quickened, but she maintained her characteristic stillness, continuing to work on her current documentation while her peripheral vision tracked Patterson as he left the processing area. Once she was certain she was alone, she carefully opened the evidence box. The rifle was a custom-built precision system that made her breath catch in her throat. The stock was adjustable carbon fiber, the barrel was match-grade stainless steel with a distinctive spiral fluting pattern, and the trigger system showed signs of professional tuning that would allow for shots measured in fractions of minutes of angle. This wasn't law enforcement equipment. This was competition-grade precision shooting hardware that belonged in the hands of Olympic marksmen or military special operations units. More concerning was what the rifle represented. Someone in Seattle had possessed a weapon system capable of precision shots at distances that most people couldn't even accurately estimate. The modifications and accessories suggested an operator with serious training and unlimited budget. This wasn't street crime equipment. This was the tool of a professional. As Nancy photographed the rifle system, her hands remained perfectly steady, despite the anxiety building in her chest. Her documentation was flawless, each image captured at the optimal angle to show both the weapon's general characteristics and its specific modifications. But beneath her professional exterior, memories were stirring that she had spent 4 years trying to suppress. She knew this rifle configuration. Not this specific weapon, but the type, the setup, the philosophy behind its construction. She had once been intimately familiar with similar systems, had spent countless hours behind comparable optics, had understood the precise mathematics of wind drift and bullet drop that made such weapons effective at extreme distances. Hey and hill, but that knowledge belonged to someone she used to be, someone whose expertise had led to consequences she was still trying to escape. Nancy Rodriguez, nervous evidence clerk, wasn't supposed to recognize specialized sniper equipment or understand the implications of finding such a weapon in a routine evidence submission. That knowledge belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose identity was buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot who she used to be. The evidence box also contained 3 spent cartridge cases, each one bearing the distinctive markings of match-grade ammunition. Nancy examined them under magnification, noting the precision of the primer strikes and the consistent ejector marks that indicated the rifle had been properly maintained and professionally operated. These weren't practice rounds or random shots. They were the remnants of deliberate, carefully planned precision shooting. She completed her documentation with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to every piece of evidence, but her mind was racing through possibilities that extended far beyond her official responsibilities. A precision rifle system of this caliber didn't appear in routine police work by accident. Someone had been using this weapon for purposes that required surgical accuracy at significant distance, and now it was sitting in the basement of a police station, waiting to be processed as evidence. The smart thing to do was complete her paperwork and move on to the next item in her queue. Nancy Rodriguez, evidence clerk, had no business speculating about the operational implications of seized weapons or the skill level required to utilize such equipment effectively. Her job was documentation, not analysis. But as she sealed the evidence box and attached her completed processing forms, Nancy couldn't shake the feeling that this weapon represented something larger, something that would eventually demand expertise she wasn't supposed to possess. The rifle was a puzzle piece that didn't fit the normal pattern of Seattle street crime, and her instincts she had spent years trying to ignore, were telling her that it wouldn't be the last piece of evidence that challenged the careful anonymity she had constructed. The basement evidence room fell back into its usual quiet rhythm, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant sound of police radios crackling from the floors above. Nancy returned to her routine documentation, processing evidence with the same nervous precision that had earned her nickname and protected her identity for 4 years. But something had shifted that morning. The appearance of the precision rifle had cracked the carefully maintained wall between her current identity and her past expertise. And in the back of her mind, Nancy Rodriguez couldn't help but wonder how long she could maintain the fiction that she was just a nervous clerk who happened to work around weapons, rather than someone who had once been among the most precise marksmen the military had ever trained. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Seattle Police Department's hierarchy was as rigid and predictable as the filing system Nancy maintained in evidence processing. At the top sat Captain Robert Hayes, a 28-year veteran whose corner office overlooked Elliott Bay, and whose primary concerns centered around budgets, politics, and maintaining his department's public image. Below him, the Detective Bureau operated with the confident swagger of investigators who solved cases and made arrests, while patrol officers occupied the middle ground of daily law enforcement. Visible, respected, essential. And then there was the basement level, where civilian employees like Nancy processed the detritus of police work in fluorescent-lit obscurity. They were the administrative foundation that kept the department functioning, but they might as well have been invisible for all the attention they received from sworn officers. Nancy had learned to navigate this hierarchy with careful precision, speaking only when spoken to, responding with just enough competence to avoid criticism but never enough expertise to attract unwanted attention. It was a delicate balance that required constant vigilance and had become second nature over her 4 years in the evidence unit. Her immediate supervisor was Carmen Walsh, a 45-year-old former patrol officer who had transferred to civilian administration after a back injury ended her street career. Walsh ran the evidence unit with military efficiency, demanding perfection in documentation while showing little interest in the people who worked under her supervision. She treated Nancy with the casual indifference reserved for reliable employees who required minimal management, present when needed, forgotten otherwise. "Rodriguez handles all the weapons processing," Walsh would tell visiting officers or new employees. "She's nervous as hell around guns, but she's thorough with the paperwork. That's what matters down here." The characterization stung every time Nancy heard it, but she had cultivated the image deliberately. Better to be seen as anxious and competent than skilled and suspicious. The persona of nervous Nancy was armor that protected her from questions she couldn't answer without revealing truths she wasn't prepared to share. Her workspace reflected this carefully constructed identity. Unlike the cluttered desks of her colleagues, Nancy's station was obsessively organized, but featured no personal touches that might invite conversation or curiosity. No family photos, no decorative items, no indication of interests or hobbies outside of work. The only deviation from standard office supplies was a small digital caliper that she used for precise measurements, but even that appeared to be standard evidence processing equipment to casual observers. The other civilian employees in the evidence unit treated Nancy with a mixture of professional courtesy and mild bewilderment. Sarah Kim, who processed narcotics evidence, had made several attempts at friendship during Nancy's first year, inviting her to lunch or after-work drinks. But Nancy's polite deflections had eventually discouraged such overtures, leaving their relationship strictly professional. "She's weird," Sarah had confided to Marcus Thompson, the evidence unit's computer specialist, during one of their coffee breaks. "Nice enough, but it's like she's afraid of letting anyone get too close. And the way she acts around the weapons evidence, You'd think she'd never seen a gun before. Marcus, a 26-year-old tech enthusiast who had joined the department straight from college, found Nancy's behavior merely eccentric rather than concerning. "Some people are just naturally anxious," he had replied. "At least she does good work, better than having someone careless handling evidence that could make or break cases." The sworn officers who occasionally ventured into the evidence unit treated Nancy with the casual dismissal reserved for administrative support staff. Detective Patterson, whose abrasive personality had earned him few friends even among his colleagues, was particularly condescending in his interactions with civilian employees. "Hey, nervous Nancy," Patterson would announce whenever he appeared at her workstation, usually accompanied by his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, who at least had the courtesy to look embarrassed by Patterson's behavior. "Got some scary guns for you to catalog. Try not to have a panic attack while you're photographing them." Chen, an 8-year veteran who had transferred to Seattle from the San Francisco Police Department, would typically offer Nancy an apologetic smile, while Patterson continued his commentary. "Mike, lay off her," Chen would occasionally interject. "She does her job better than half the people in this building." But even Chen's defense carried an implicit assumption that Nancy was exactly what she appeared to be: a nervous civilian employee who happened to be competent at paperwork, despite her obvious anxiety around weapons. The detective had no reason to suspect that Nancy's careful documentation often included observations that could have provided valuable investigative leads, or that her apparent nervousness masked analytical skills that extended far beyond basic evidence processing. Officer Jennifer Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, represented the younger generation of patrol officers who treated civilian employees with casual friendliness rather than dismissive authority. Jennifer would stop by the evidence unit during slow periods, sharing gossip about department politics or complaining about difficult arrests while Nancy worked at her station. "You're so lucky to work down here," Jennifer had commented the previous week while Nancy processed evidence from a domestic violence call. "No dealing with crazy people on the street, no shift work, no getting shot at. Must be nice to have a safe, quiet job." Nancy had nodded and smiled, offering the appropriate response while privately reflecting on the irony of a patrol officer considering her job safe. If Jennifer had known the truth about Nancy's background, she might have reconsidered her assumptions about which of them was better equipped to handle dangerous situations. The evidence unit's isolation from the rest of the department meant that Nancy rarely interacted with higher-ranking officials, but occasional visits from supervisors or external auditors provided glimpses into how she was perceived by department leadership. Captain Hayes had toured the facility twice during Nancy's tenure, both times treating her as part of the furniture rather than a person worthy of individual attention. "This is our weapons processing station," Walsh had explained during the captain's most recent visit. "Rodriguez handles all firearms evidence. She's very thorough, very detail-oriented, never had any problems with her work." Hayes had glanced at Nancy's workstation with the distant interest of someone reviewing inventory, nodded approvingly at the organized appearance of her desk, and moved on without acknowledging her presence. To him, she was simply another administrative resource, no more noteworthy than the filing cabinets or computer terminals that surrounded her. But the most revealing interactions came during the department's monthly training sessions, when civilian employees were required to attend presentations on topics ranging from workplace safety to evidence handling procedures. Nancy would sit near the back of the conference room, taking meticulous notes, while sworn officers dominated the discussions with questions and comments that displayed their field experience. During a recent presentation on ballistics evidence, Detective Anthony Rodriguez, no relation to Nancy, had challenged the instructor's explanation of bullet trajectory calculations. "That's all theoretical," he had argued. "In real-world situations, you've got environmental factors that make those formulas pretty much useless. Wind, temperature, humidity. They all affect bullet path in ways that basic ballistics can't predict." Nancy had listened to the exchange with growing frustration, knowing that the detective's understanding of environmental ballistics was superficial at best. She could have explained the precise mathematical relationships between atmospheric conditions and projectile behavior, could have described how expert marksmen compensated for variables that most people never considered. But nervous Nancy wouldn't possess such knowledge, so she remained silent while the discussion continued around her. The training session had concluded with the instructor's acknowledgement that real-world ballistics could be complex, but that civilian evidence processors only needed to understand basic documentation requirements. Nancy had nodded along with her colleagues while privately cataloging the gaps in the department's understanding of advanced ballistics principles. These moments of enforced silence were the most difficult part of maintaining her cover. Watching professionals struggle with concepts she could easily clarify, seeing investigations that might benefit from insights she couldn't share, knowing that her expertise could contribute to solving cases but being unable to offer that knowledge without revealing her true background. The lunch hour in the evidence unit was typically quiet, with most employees eating at their desks while continuing to work on their documentation. Nancy used this time to review case files and update her private logbook, noting patterns and connections that might prove significant but that fell outside her official responsibilities. It was during one such lunch break that she overheard a conversation between Sarah Kim and Marcus Thompson that made her pause in her documentation. "Did you hear about the shooting last week?" Sarah was asking, her voice carrying the excited tone of someone sharing gossip. "The one where the patrol officers called for SWAT backup?" Marcus nodded, pausing in his typing. "Downtown, right? Some kind of standoff situation?" "Yeah, but here's the weird part," Sarah continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I heard from Jenny and records that they couldn't get a clean shot. The suspect was holed up in a building across from Pioneer Square, and the SWAT snipers couldn't find an angle that would guarantee stopping him without risking civilians." Nancy's attention sharpened, though she continued to appear focused on her own work. SWAT deployment scenarios were exactly the kind of tactical situation where her suppressed expertise might prove relevant, but they were also the kind of discussions that nervous Nancy would have no reason to follow with interest. "So what happened?" Marcus was asking. "They had to wait him out," Sarah replied. "Took 6 hours before he finally gave up and surrendered." But apparently the whole time, the incident commanders were frustrated because they had this perfect tactical setup except for the shooting position. The building geometry just didn't work for their equipment. The conversation moved on to other department gossip, but Nancy found herself thinking about the tactical problems Sarah had described. Building geometry, sight lines, equipment limitations. These were the kinds of challenges she had once been trained to solve, the complex three-dimensional puzzles that separated competent marksmen from true precision specialists. As the afternoon progressed, Nancy completed her routine evidence processing while her mind continued to analyze the downtown shooting scenario. She could envision the tactical situation, could mentally map the sight lines and calculate the angles that might have provided effective shooting positions. It was an intellectual exercise that she hadn't allowed herself to pursue in years, and the familiar analytical process was both satisfying and disturbing. By the end of her shift, Nancy had processed 12 items of evidence, updated 17 case files, and maintained the perfect documentation standards that had earned her a reputation for reliability. She had also confirmed, once again, that her colleagues saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a nervous, competent civilian employee who was useful for administrative tasks, but unremarkable in every other respect. But as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave for the day, Nancy couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed anonymity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The precision rifle system she had processed that morning represented the kind of equipment that might eventually require expertise she wasn't supposed to possess. And conversations like the one she had overheard about tactical shooting positions reminded her that the skills she had buried weren't just professional knowledge, they were capabilities that might someday be needed to save lives. The basement evidence unit returned to its evening quiet as Nancy Rodriguez, nervous civilian employee, walked to her car in the department parking garage. But the woman behind that carefully maintained facade carried with her the growing awareness that her past and present were on a collision course that might soon make her dual identity impossible to sustain. Nancy's apartment in the Ballard neighborhood was as carefully curated as her workplace persona, deliberately ordinary, forgettably middle class, designed to deflect curiosity rather than invite it. The one-bedroom unit occupied the second floor of a converted craftsman house, with views of the Ship Canal and rent that consumed exactly 38% of her evidence clerk's salary. To any casual observer, it was the home of someone who lived a quiet, unremarkable life. But hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom closet, sealed in a climate-controlled container that she checked monthly but hadn't opened in 3 years, lay the remnants of who she used to be. Staff Sergeant Nancy Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. Scout Sniper. Military Occupational Specialty 0317. Honor graduate of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq. Confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters. Recipient of the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. The woman who now spent her days nervously cataloging seized weapons had once been among the most lethal precision marksmen the Marine Corps had ever trained. That evening, after processing the custom rifle that had stirred memories she'd spent years suppressing, Nancy found herself standing before the sealed container for the first time since moving to Seattle. Her hands trembled, not with the nervous anxiety that characterized her workplace persona, but with the weight of confronting a past she had tried desperately to leave behind. Inside the container lay the physical evidence of her former life. Her dress blue uniform, pressed and perfect, the ribbons and medals arranged with parade ground precision. Her sniper logbook, leather-bound and filled with range cards, weather data, and the cold mathematics of long-range precision shooting. Photographs from her deployments, images of herself in combat gear, rifle in hand, surrounded by Marines who had trusted her to protect them from distances they couldn't even see. On tretzel, and, at the bottom of the container, wrapped in oiled cloth, her personal M40A5 sniper rifle. The weapon that had been her constant companion through 2 deployments, the tool through which she had saved countless lives and taken others when necessary. It was a rifle she could field strip blindfolded, a system she understood more intimately than most people understood their own bodies. Nancy lifted the photographs with careful reverence, studying faces of men and women who had called her ghost for her ability to remain invisible until the moment she needed to act. Staff Sergeant Martinez, her spotter, who had died in an IED explosion 6 months into her 2nd deployment. Corporal Jackson, the forward observer who had credited Nancy with saving his life during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, her commanding officer, who had recommended her for promotion and advanced sniper training before everything went wrong. The memories came flooding back with unwelcome clarity, the weight of the rifle across her shoulders during 12-hour observation missions. The mathematics of wind and distance that she could calculate faster than most people could perform basic arithmetic. The absolute stillness required to remain hidden for hours while waiting for the perfect shot. The controlled breathing techniques that slowed her heart rate to optimize accuracy. The split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She had been exceptional at her job, perhaps too exceptional. Her reputation for impossible shots had spread throughout the Corps, earning her assignments to increasingly dangerous missions where conventional tactics had failed. She was the marksman they called when targets seemed unreachable, when surgical precision was required at distances that challenged the limits of equipment and skill. The mission that ended her military career was supposed to have been routine by her standards. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a Taliban compound outside Helmand province. The target was a bomb maker responsible for IEDs that had killed dozens of coalition forces. Standard procedure called for calling in airstrikes, but the compound was surrounded by civilian buildings, making collateral damage unacceptable. Nancy and her spotter, Sergeant First Class David Kim, had been inserted 2 kilometers from the target area under cover of darkness. Their mission was simple: eliminate the bomb maker with a single precision shot, then extract without engaging additional targets. It was the kind of surgical strike that Nancy had executed successfully dozens of times. They had established their hide site in the ruins of an ancient building, providing clear sightlines to the target compound, while remaining invisible to enemy observation. Nancy had spent hours studying the target area through her scope, mapping guard positions, timing patrol patterns, calculating environmental factors that would affect her shot. The wind conditions were challenging, variable gusts between 8 and 15 miles per hour, with thermal currents rising from the desert floor that created shifting mirage patterns. But Nancy had successfully engaged targets under similar conditions before. She adjusted her scope settings, calculated the necessary holds for wind drift and bullet drop, and waited for the optimal moment. The target appeared in her crosshairs at 1,347 meters, well within her effective range, but requiring absolute precision to guarantee a clean hit. Nancy controlled her breathing, settled the crosshairs on the center of her target's chest, and began her trigger pull with the smooth, steady pressure that had become automatic after thousands of practice shots. But in the fraction of a second between her decision to fire and the bullet's impact, a child had wandered into the compound courtyard. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, chasing a ball that had bounced into Nancy's field of fire. She saw him in her peripheral vision just as her rifle fired, watched in horror as her perfectly aimed shot struck its intended target, while the child stood mere feet away, close enough that the bullet's impact sprayed him with debris and blood. The mission was technically successful, the bomb maker was eliminated, and no coalition forces were endangered, but the image of that child, covered in blood and screaming in terror, became seared into Nancy's memory, with a clarity that no amount of therapy or medication could blur. The psychological evaluation following her return stateside had determined that she was suffering from acute combat stress reaction, complicated by moral injury related to the civilian proximity of her final engagement. The Marine Corps offered her continued treatment and the possibility of reassignment to training duties, but Nancy couldn't imagine touching a sniper rifle again without seeing that child's face. She had requested immediate discharge and spent the next 18 months in Veterans Affairs counseling trying to process guilt and trauma that seemed impossible to overcome. The therapist talked about the importance of her service, the lives she had saved, the successful missions that had protected her fellow Marines, but none of that seemed to matter compared to the memory of a terrified child whose childhood had been destroyed by her precision. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Nancy found herself unemployed, isolated, and struggling with anxiety that made normal social interactions nearly impossible. Her military benefits provided basic financial support, but she needed something more than survival. She needed a purpose that didn't involve weapons or violence or the possibility of causing harm to innocent people. The job at the Seattle Police Department had seemed like a reasonable compromise. She could use her administrative skills, contribute to law enforcement objectives, and remain connected to a mission-oriented environment without carrying a weapon or making life-or-death decisions. The evidence unit position required attention to detail and reliability, qualities she possessed in abundance, while keeping her far from operational activities that might trigger her trauma responses. But she hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to suppress her professional knowledge while working around weapons daily. Every rifle that crossed her desk, every ballistics report she processed, every tactical conversation she overheard, reminded her of capabilities she was trying to forget. The precision rifle system she had cataloged that morning was exactly the kind of equipment she had once mastered, and handling it had awakened memories and instincts that she thought she had successfully buried. Nancy closed the container and returned it to its hiding place, but the damage was done. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself thinking like a sniper again, analyzing tactical problems, calculating shooting solutions, considering the environmental factors that could affect long-range precision shots. It was thinking that felt natural and familiar and absolutely terrifying. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood at her apartment window, looking out over the Seattle skyline while her mind processed the implications of the day's events. The custom rifle and evidence wasn't there by coincidence. Someone in the city possessed professional-grade precision shooting equipment, and that equipment had been used for purposes serious enough to result in police seizure. More troubling was her own response to handling the weapon. Despite years of therapy and deliberate distance from anything related to military marksmanship, her muscle memory had remained intact. She had instinctively recognized the rifle's capabilities, understood its tactical applications, and felt the familiar comfort of handling a precision weapon system. The knowledge was still there, waiting just beneath the surface of her carefully constructed civilian identity. As night fell over Seattle, Nancy Rodriguez, former Marine sniper, current evidence clerk, voluntary exile from the world of precision marksmanship, found herself confronting the possibility that her past and present were about to collide in ways she couldn't control. The appearance of professional-grade sniper equipment and routine police evidence suggested that someone else in the city possessed her specialized skills. And if that someone decided to use those skills against innocent people, Nancy might be forced to choose between maintaining her anonymity and preventing the kind of tragedy she had spent 3 years trying to forget. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fled from military service because she couldn't bear the thought of her precision causing collateral damage to innocent civilians. But if a situation arose where those same skills could prevent harm to innocents, could she maintain her cover while people died? Could she live with the knowledge that she had chosen personal safety over public protection? Outside her window, the lights of Seattle stretched toward the horizon, millions of people living their lives in blissful ignorance of the tactical considerations that Nancy couldn't stop herself from calculating. Fields of fire, concealment positions, ranges and angles. Her mind automatically cataloged the urban environment in terms that hadn't changed since her military training. Staff Sergeant Nancy Rodriguez was supposed to be dead and buried, her expertise sealed away with her dress blues and her sniper rifle. But as Nancy tried to sleep that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her former identity was stirring back to life, awakening capabilities that she had sworn never to use again. The question that haunted her dreams was simple. When the time came to choose between Nancy Rodriguez, the nervous evidence clerk, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the Marine sniper, which identity would prove stronger? 3 days after processing the custom rifle, Nancy arrived at work to find the evidence unit buzzing with unusual activity. Carmen Walsh was standing at the central processing station, surrounded by boxes of evidence, and looking more agitated than Nancy had seen her in months. Detective Patterson was there too, along with Detective Chen and 2 officers Nancy didn't recognize, both wearing the tactical gear and bearing that marked them as members of the department's Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. "Rodriguez," Walsh called out as Nancy approached her workstation, "drop whatever you're working on. We need you to process this evidence immediately. Priority case." Nancy nodded, slipping into her familiar role of compliant subordination while her eyes quickly assessed the scene. The evidence boxes bore fresh tape and timestamps from the previous night, suggesting a major incident that had occurred while she was at home, wrestling with memories of her military past. "What happened?" she asked, directing the question to Walsh but keeping her voice at the barely audible level that had become her trademark. Detective Patterson answered before Walsh could respond. "Bank robbery gone wrong downtown. 3 suspects, automatic weapons, civilian hostages. They barricaded themselves in the First National Building on Pine Street." He gestured toward the evidence boxes with obvious frustration. "SWAT finally took them down, but it was a mess. We need every piece of evidence processed perfectly because this is going to be high profile." Nancy began organizing the evidence boxes methodically, but her mind was already analyzing the tactical implications of Patterson's description. First National was a 30-story office building in the heart of Seattle's financial district, surrounded by other high-rises and pedestrian areas. Any SWAT operation in that environment would have been extraordinarily complex, with civilian safety concerns paramount and limited tactical options. As she opened the first evidence box, Detective Chen provided additional details. The suspects had military-grade equipment: M4 carbines, tactical vests, coordinated movements. This wasn't some amateur crew. These guys had serious training. Nancy's hands remained steady as she began photographing the seized weapons. But internally, she was calculating the tactical challenges such a scenario would have presented. Urban environment, multiple suspects with advanced weapons, civilian hostages, surrounding buildings full of potential collateral casualties. It was exactly the kind of situation where precision marksmanship might have provided solutions that conventional tactics couldn't achieve. "How long did the standoff last?" she asked, maintaining her nervous tone while documenting each weapon with professional precision. 14 hours, replied one of the SWAT officers, a burly sergeant named Williams, whose tactical vest still bore scuff marks from the previous night's operation. "From 6 p.m. yesterday until 8 a.m. this morning. We had the building surrounded, but they'd positioned themselves perfectly to control all the main access points." Nancy photographed an M4 carbine that showed signs of professional modification, custom trigger, enhanced optics, shortened barrel optimized for close-quarters combat. These weren't weapons purchased by casual criminals. They represented significant investment and expertise in tactical equipment selection. "Any injuries?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Detective Chen's expression darkened. 3 civilians wounded. 1 SWAT officer down with a serious leg wound. Could have been much worse if we hadn't managed to get most of the hostages out through the service tunnels. As Nancy continued processing evidence, Sergeant Williams began describing the tactical challenges they had faced. The suspects knew exactly what they were doing. They'd studied the building layout, blocked the main stairwells, controlled the elevators. Every time we tried to advance, they had perfect fields of fire down the corridors. "What about the roof?" Nancy asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. It was exactly the kind of tactical inquiry that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez would have posed. but completely inappropriate coming from a nervous evidence clerk. Williams looked at her with surprise. The roof? Why would you ask about that? Nancy felt panic rise in her chest, but forced herself to maintain her nervous demeanor. I mean, in movies, they always… Sorry, I shouldn't have asked. I don't know anything about this stuff. But Williams was studying her with increased interest. Actually, that's a good question. We did consider roof access, but the building design made it impossible. The suspects had positioned themselves on the 20th floor, with clear sightlines to the roof access points. Anyone trying to approach from above would have been exposed to their fire. Nancy nodded and returned to her documentation, but she could feel Williams continuing to observe her. The SWAT sergeant had noticed something in her question that didn't align with her nervous civilian image, and she needed to be more careful about suppressing her tactical knowledge. As she worked through the evidence, a clearer picture of the previous night's events began to emerge. The three suspects had been exceptionally well prepared, with equipment and tactics that suggested military or law enforcement training. They had chosen their position with expertise that maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing law enforcement options for resolution. The weird thing, Detective Patterson was saying to his partner, is that they never made any demands. No ransom requests, no political statements, nothing. They just held position and waited. Nancy's analytical mind immediately recognized the significance of this detail. Professional criminals committing bank robbery would have escape plans and specific objectives. The suspect's behavior suggested a different motivation, possibly using the bank robbery as cover for another operation, or testing law enforcement response capabilities for future attacks. "Did they take anything from the bank?" she asked, again keeping her voice carefully modulated to sound like idle curiosity rather than tactical analysis. "That's what's strange," Detective Chen replied. "The vault was never breached. They had the capability and the time, but they didn't even attempt to access the money. It's like the robbery was secondary to whatever else they were planning." This information confirmed Nancy's growing suspicion that the bank incident was more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. The suspect's equipment, tactics, and behavior patterns suggested a level of sophistication that extended far beyond conventional criminal activity. As she continued processing evidence, Nancy found herself involuntarily analyzing the tactical situation from both perspectives: law enforcement response and suspect capabilities. The building's architecture would have created significant challenges for any assault team, while providing the suspects with numerous defensive advantages. Traditional SWAT tactics would have been limited by civilian safety concerns and the urban environment's complexity. "How did you finally resolve it?" she asked, genuinely curious about how the department had overcome such challenging tactical conditions. Sergeant Williams's expression grew grim. "We got lucky. One of the suspects made a mistake, exposed himself for just a few seconds while moving between positions. Our sniper team had been watching for hours, waiting for any opportunity." Nancy's blood went cold. "Sniper team?" "Two-man team positioned in the building across the street," Williams explained. "Detective Morrison and Officer Hayes from our tactical unit. They'd been on overwatch for the entire operation, but the angles were impossible until that one moment." Nancy continued her documentation while processing this information. A sniper team had been deployed, but had struggled with the same challenges that would have confronted any precision marksman in that environment: building geometry, limited sightlines, civilian safety concerns. It was exactly the kind of tactical problem she had once specialized in solving. "Was it a difficult shot?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question as Williams looked at her with renewed interest. "Very difficult," he replied slowly. "About 400 meters, urban environment, wind conditions, and the target was only exposed for maybe 3 seconds. Morrison is good, but he said it was one of the hardest shots he'd ever attempted." Nancy nodded and smiled nervously, but her mind was racing through the ballistics calculations such a shot would have required. 400 meters in an urban environment with variable wind patterns and limited exposure time. It was well within her capabilities, but would have challenged most police snipers operating with standard equipment and training. As the morning progressed, more details emerged about the previous night's operation. The suspects had been neutralized, but not before causing significant disruption to downtown Seattle and requiring the deployment of nearly every tactical resource the department possessed. It was exactly the kind of complex urban scenario that demonstrated the limitations of conventional law enforcement responses to well-trained adversaries. Detective Patterson was reviewing Nancy's processed evidence when his radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "All units, we have reports of suspicious activity at the Harborview building. Possible connection to last night's incident. SWAT is responding." Nancy's hands stilled on the evidence she was cataloging. Harborview was a 42-story office complex near the waterfront, even more challenging tactically than the First National building. If last night's suspects had been part of a larger operation, the department might be facing another prolonged standoff with even more complex tactical challenges. "Rodriguez," Walsh called out, "finish up whatever you're working on. If this is connected to last night, we're going to need every piece of evidence processed immediately." As Nancy completed her documentation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the previous night's bank incident had been a testing ground, a way for someone to evaluate law enforcement response capabilities and identify weaknesses in the department's tactical procedures. The suspects' behavior, their equipment choices, their positioning within the building, all suggested a level of planning that extended beyond a single criminal operation. More troubling was her own response to the tactical information she was processing. Despite 3 years of civilian life and deliberate distance from anything related to precision marksmanship, she found herself automatically analyzing the challenges the SWAT team had faced and considering alternative approaches that might have resolved the situation more efficiently. The precision rifle system she had processed earlier in the week suddenly took on new significance. If the bank robbery had been part of a larger pattern of activity, that custom weapon might represent capabilities that the department would soon face in an even more challenging environment. As emergency vehicles screamed past the police station heading toward Harborview, Nancy Rodriguez realized that her carefully maintained anonymity might be about to encounter a test she couldn't avoid. If the situation developing across the city required the kind of precision marksmanship expertise she possessed, how long could she maintain the fiction that she was just a nervous evidence clerk who happened to work around weapons? The catalyst moment she had been dreading for 3 years might be approaching faster than she had ever imagined. The Harborview incident began as Nancy was finishing her evidence documentation from the previous night's bank robbery, but within 30 minutes it had escalated into something far more serious than anyone in the department had anticipated. The initial reports of suspicious activity quickly transformed into confirmed armed suspects occupying multiple floors of the waterfront office complex, with an unknown number of hostages and what appeared to be a coordinated tactical operation. Then, Captain Hayes arrived at the evidence unit personally, something Nancy had never witnessed in her 4 years with the department, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Walsh," he barked, "I need Rodriguez upstairs immediately. We've got a situation developing and I need her expertise with the weapons evidence from last night." Nancy felt her stomach clench. Being summoned personally by the captain meant exposure, attention, the possibility of questions she couldn't answer without revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. "Sir," Walsh responded, clearly as surprised as Nancy by the unusual request, "Rodriguez is a civilian evidence clerk. She doesn't have clearance for tactical briefings." "Today she does," Hayes replied grimly. "The weapons those bank suspects were carrying match descriptions of equipment stolen from a federal armory 3 months ago. Rodriguez has been processing military-grade firearms longer than anyone else in this department, and I need her analysis of what we might be facing." As Nancy followed Captain Hayes through corridors she had never seen, her mind raced through the implications of what she had just learned. Military armory theft, coordinated attacks on multiple targets, suspects with professional-level training and equipment. This wasn't random criminal activity. Someone was conducting what amounted to asymmetric warfare in downtown Seattle. The department's Tactical Operations Center occupied the 4th floor, a space Nancy had only glimpsed through reinforced glass doors during her rare trips to the upper levels. Now she found herself in the heart of law enforcement crisis response, surrounded by radio equipment, tactical maps and computer screens displaying real-time surveillance feeds from around the Harborview building. Detective Patterson looked up in surprise as Nancy entered behind Captain Hayes. "Captain, with respect, why is the evidence clerk here? This is a tactical briefing." "Because the evidence clerk has been handling military weapons all morning and might have insights we need," Hayes replied tersely. "Rodriguez, I need you to look at these photographs and tell me exactly what we're dealing with. A large monitor displayed surveillance images captured by police drones circling the Harbor View building. Nancy forced herself to maintain her nervous demeanor while studying tactical deployments that made her blood run cold. The suspects had positioned themselves with textbook precision, controlling key sight lines and creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any conventional assault extremely costly. But what truly alarmed her were the weapons visible in the surveillance footage. The custom rifle system she had processed earlier in the week was just one component of an arsenal that included military-grade precision equipment, advanced optics, and tactical accessories that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in specialized hardware. The rifle configuration suggests long-range precision capabilities, Nancy said carefully, keeping her voice at its characteristic nervous pitch while providing analysis that was technically accurate but deliberately vague. The optics appear to be military specification, designed for extended range engagement. Sergeant Williams, whom she recognized from that morning's evidence processing, was studying a tactical map of the Harbor View building. We've got 12 floors occupied by hostiles, unknown number of civilians, and sight lines that cover every approach route. Our sniper teams can't establish effective positions because of the building geometry. Nancy's analytical mind immediately began processing the tactical problem, but she forced herself to remain silent. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez could have identified multiple solutions to the challenges Williams was describing, but Nancy, the evidence clerk, had no business offering tactical advice. Detective Chen was coordinating with federal agencies via secure phone lines. FBI is sending their hostage rescue team, but they won't arrive for another 4 hours. ATF confirms that the weapons match stolen federal inventory. We're looking at military-grade precision equipment in the hands of subjects with advanced tactical training. As Nancy listened to the briefing, a clearer picture of the threat emerged. The suspects weren't random criminals or even organized crime. They were operating with military precision and equipment that suggested either foreign state actors or domestic terrorists with access to federal weapon systems. The bank robbery had been reconnaissance, testing police response times and capabilities in preparation for this larger operation. "Captain," Detective Patterson announced, looking up from his communication equipment, "we're getting reports of additional suspicious activity at the Space Needle and Pike Place market. This might be coordinated across multiple targets." Hayes cursed under his breath. "They're stretching our resources across the entire city. Classic asymmetric warfare tactics." He turned to Nancy with an expression of desperate calculation. "Rodriguez, you've processed more seized weapons than anyone in this department. In your professional opinion, what kind of capabilities are we facing?" The question put Nancy in an impossible position. Her professional opinion as an evidence clerk would be limited to basic technical specifications. But her professional opinion as a former Marine sniper would include tactical assessments that could save lives. If she was willing to reveal expertise, she had spent 3 years hiding. "The equipment suggests extensive range capabilities," she said carefully. "The modifications indicate precision work, probably custom gunsmithing. Someone invested significant resources in these weapon systems." It was accurate, but unhelpfully vague, the kind of analysis Nancy, the nervous clerk, might provide. But as she spoke, Nancy could see tactical solutions that the department wasn't considering, alternative approaches that might resolve the crisis with minimal casualties. Sergeant Williams was growing increasingly frustrated with the tactical limitations they faced. Every conventional approach puts civilians at risk. We can't use flashbangs or tear gas because of the hostages. We can't establish effective overwatch positions because of the building's defensive advantages. And now they're telling us we might have similar situations developing across the city. Nancy watched the surveillance feeds showing suspects moving with military precision through the Harbor View building, establishing defensive positions that demonstrated advanced tactical training. These weren't amateur terrorists. They were operators who understood urban warfare principles and had planned this operation with professional competence. Her hands began to shake, not with the nervous anxiety that characterized her workplace persona, but with the recognition that people were going to die because she was choosing personal safety over public protection. The tactical solutions existed, but implementing them would require revealing capabilities she had sworn never to use again. "Rodriguez," Captain Hayes said, "you're the closest thing we have to a weapons expert right now. I need you to review all the evidence from last night and provide a complete assessment of their capabilities. Full tactical analysis, I don't care if it's outside your normal job description. The request was both an opportunity and a trap. Nancy could provide the analysis Hayes needed, but doing so would require demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond evidence processing. Yet people's lives hung in the balance, and her expertise might be the difference between successful resolution and catastrophic casualties. "I'll need access to all the tactical intelligence," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Surveillance footage, building plans, communication intercepts, everything you have." Hayes nodded and gestured to Detective Chen. "Give her whatever she needs." Full access. As Nancy settled at a computer terminal to review the tactical intelligence, she realized she was crossing a line she had never intended to cross. But the alternative, watching innocent people die while she protected her anonymity, was becoming impossible to accept. The building plans for Harborview revealed why conventional tactics were failing. The suspects had chosen their positions with expertise that maximized their defensive advantages while creating killing fields in every approach corridor. Standard SWAT procedures would result in significant casualties among both law enforcement and hostages. But Nancy could see alternatives that others were missing. Unconventional approach routes, angles of attack that utilized building geometry rather than fighting against it, precision solutions that could neutralize key threats without exposing assault teams to defensive fire. "Captain," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in 3 years, "I think I see some tactical options that might work." Hayes looked up from his radio coordination with obvious surprise. The nervous evidence clerk was gone, replaced by someone who spoke with quiet, professional confidence. "What kind of options?" he asked. Nancy pointed to the building plans, her finger tracing approach routes that no one else had considered. "The suspects are positioned to control conventional assault routes, but they've left gaps in their coverage. There are ways to approach that would avoid their prepared positions." Sergeant Williams studied her analysis with growing interest. "You're talking about extremely complex tactical maneuvers. That would require precision coordination and specialized capabilities." "Yes," Nancy replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since she had known him. "It would." In that moment, everyone in the Tactical Operations Center realized that Nancy Rodriguez was not who they had thought she was. The nervous evidence clerk had vanished, replaced by someone who analyzed urban warfare scenarios with professional competence that extended far beyond civilian law enforcement training. Captain Hayes studied Nancy with new understanding. "Rodriguez, exactly what kind of experience do you have with tactical operations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Nancy could retreat back into her nervous clerk persona, deflect the inquiry, and return to the safety of anonymity. Or she could acknowledge what everyone in the room was beginning to suspect, that she possessed expertise that could save lives if she was willing to use it. Outside the windows of the Tactical Operations Center, emergency vehicles continued arriving as the crisis expanded across multiple locations. Time was running out, and decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether the day ended with successful resolution or catastrophic tragedy. Nancy Rodriguez stood at the crossroads between her past and present, between the identity she had constructed and the person she had once been. The choice she made would determine not only her own future, but the fate of every innocent person trapped in the escalating siege that was consuming Seattle. The silence in the Tactical Operations Center stretched for what felt like an eternity as Captain Hayes waited for Nancy's answer. Around them, radio chatter continued with updates from the escalating crisis. Harborview building secure but with confirmed hostages. Suspicious activity at 3 additional locations. Federal agencies mobilizing resources that wouldn't arrive for hours. But in that moment, the entire focus of the room had narrowed to the quiet evidence clerk, who had just demonstrated tactical knowledge that civilian employees weren't supposed to possess. "Rodriguez," Hayes repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. "I asked you a direct question. What kind of tactical experience do you have?" Nancy felt the weight of 3 years of carefully constructed deception pressing down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to deflect, to retreat back into the nervous persona that had protected her from exactly this kind of scrutiny. But the surveillance monitors surrounding her showed innocent people trapped in a crisis that was expanding beyond the department's ability to resolve with conventional methods. She began, then stopped, unable to force the lie that would maintain her cover while people's lives hung in the balance. Detective Patterson, who had spent 3 years dismissing her as Nervous Nancy, was studying her with growing suspicion. "Captain, something's not right here. Evidence clerks don't analyze building plans like military tacticians. And that assessment she just gave, that's not civilian law enforcement knowledge." Sergeant Williams pulled up Nancy's personnel file on his computer terminal, scanning through information that had seemed routine when she was hired but now appeared inadequate. Her background check shows civilian employment history, some college, standard administrative skills, nothing about military service or tactical training. Nancy's pulse quickened as she realized her carefully constructed identity was unraveling in real time. The false employment history, the deliberately mundane references, the complete absence of any mention of her Marine Corps service. It had all been designed to hide her past, but now that deception was about to expose her when she most needed credibility. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible." Hayes held up a hand to silence the room's growing murmur of conversation. "Go ahead, Rodriguez, and remember that lives are at stake, so I need the absolute truth." Nancy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her hidden identity about to be revealed after 3 years of careful concealment. "My name is Nancy Rodriguez, but that's not the whole truth. I'm former Staff Sergeant Nancy Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, Military Occupational Specialty 0317. The announcement hit the room like a physical blow. Detective Patterson's mouth fell open in shock. Sergeant Williams stopped typing mid-sentence. Even Captain Hayes, who had seen enough surprises in his career to maintain professional composure under most circumstances, stared at Nancy with undisguised amazement. "Scout Sniper," Detective Chen said quietly, recognizing the MOS designation. "You're telling us that our nervous evidence clerk is a Marine Corps sniper." "Was," Nancy corrected, her voice carrying the weight of painful memories. "2 deployments, Afghanistan and Iraq. I left the service 3 years ago and deliberately concealed my background because I wanted nothing more to do with weapons or tactical operations." Sergeant Williams was pulling up military databases on his computer, cross-referencing Nancy's information with Department of Defense records. Staff Sergeant Nancy M. Rodriguez, USMC, served 2015 to 2021. Honorable discharge, awarded Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. He looked up from his screen with an expression approaching awe. "Jesus Christ, Rodriguez, you're not just any sniper. You're one of the most decorated precision marksmen in recent Marine Corps history." The revelation transformed the entire dynamic of the room. Nancy was no longer the nervous civilian employee who happened to be present during a crisis. She was potentially the most qualified tactical specialist the department had access to during their most challenging operational situation in years. "Why?" Captain Hayes asked. "Why hide this? We could have used someone with your expertise. Hell, we could have built our entire tactical program around someone with your qualifications." Nancy felt the familiar weight of guilt and trauma that had driven her to civilian life in the first place. "Because the last time I used those skills, a child almost died. Because I came home from deployment carrying more ghosts than I could handle. Because I wanted to be normal. To work a quiet job where my decisions didn't determine who lived and who died." The emotional honesty of her response seemed to resonate with the room's law enforcement professionals, many of whom understood the psychological cost of life-and-death decision-making. But Captain Hayes pressed forward with the practical implications of her revelation. "Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, right now we have a tactical situation that's beyond our current capabilities. Multiple locations, professional-grade opposition, civilian casualties mounting. I need to know, can you help us resolve this? Or are you still running from who you used to be?" The question struck at the core of Nancy's internal conflict. For 3 years, she had defined herself by what she was running from, rather than what she might be running toward. The quiet life she had built was safe and predictable, but it had also been a form of professional and personal exile. Before she could answer, Detective Chen's radio crackled with urgent traffic. "All units. Harborview situation escalating. Suspects have moved hostages to upper floors and are demanding media coverage. They're threatening to begin executing civilians if their demands aren't met within 2 hours." Nancy felt the familiar surge of tactical thinking that she had spent years trying to suppress. 2 hours wasn't enough time for federal resources to arrive and organize a response. The department's current tactical capabilities were insufficient for the complex urban warfare scenario they faced. Without intervention, innocent people were going to die. What exactly are their demands? She asked, her military bearing beginning to surface as the civilian persona she had maintained for years started to dissolve. They want nationwide television coverage and a platform to broadcast some kind of political statement, Detective Patterson replied. But intelligence suggests this is just buying time while they prepare for something larger. Nancy moved to the surveillance monitors, studying the tactical situation with professional analysis that she had been hiding since her first day at the police department. The suspects' positions, their movement patterns, their equipment deployment, everything indicated a level of planning and expertise that matched her own military training. "They're not just holding hostages," she said, her voice carrying the confident assessment of someone accustomed to reading battlefield conditions. "They're creating a defensive position that maximizes their advantages while minimizing our options. This is designed to draw in maximum law enforcement resources and create the largest possible media spectacle." Sergeant Williams was coordinating with multiple agencies via radio and computer terminals. "FBI Tactical Assessment confirms your analysis. They believe this is part of a larger operation designed to test and potentially expose law enforcement response capabilities." Nancy studied the building plans with the systematic approach she had once applied to mission planning and combat zones. Harborview's architecture created natural defensive advantages that the suspects were exploiting with professional competence, but she could also see vulnerabilities that conventional tactical thinking was missing. "Captain," she said, turning to face Hayes directly, "I can see solutions to this tactical problem, but implementing them would require capabilities that your current teams don't possess." "What kind of capabilities?" Hayes asked. "Precision marksmanship at extended range under urban conditions. Complex approach routes that bypass their prepared defensive positions. Real-time tactical coordination that adapts to changing battlefield conditions." Nancy paused, knowing that her next words would irrevocably commit her to a path she had been avoiding for 3 years. "The kind of capabilities I used to specialize in." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of what Nancy was suggesting. She wasn't just offering to advise on tactical planning. She was offering to personally engage in the kind of precision operations that had defined her military career. Detective Patterson broke the silence with obvious skepticism. "With respect, Rodriguez, or whatever your real credentials are, this isn't Afghanistan. We can't just start taking precision shots in downtown Seattle without considering civilian casualties and legal ramifications." "You think I don't understand civilian casualties?" Nancy replied, her voice carrying an edge that no one in the room had ever heard from the nervous evidence clerk. "You think I don't know what it's like to live with the consequences of precision shooting in complex environments? I left the military because I understood those consequences better than anyone." Captain Hayes studied Nancy with the calculating expression of someone weighing impossible options. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I need a direct answer. If I authorize tactical deployment, can you resolve this situation with minimal civilian casualties?" Nancy felt the weight of her past and present converging in a single moment of decision. She could retreat back into anonymity, maintain the safety of her civilian identity, and let others handle the crisis with whatever capabilities they possessed. Or she could embrace the skills that had once defined her, accept the risks and responsibilities that came with precision marksmanship, and attempt to prevent the kind of tragedy that her expertise might be uniquely qualified to address. Outside the Tactical Operations Center windows, news helicopters were beginning to circle the Harborview building, broadcasting images of the crisis to a nationwide audience. Time was running out, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood of casualties that might have been prevented by immediate action. "Yes," Nancy said finally, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with an impossible decision. "I can resolve this. But I'll need equipment, support, and complete tactical authority to implement solutions that won't fit conventional law enforcement procedures." Captain Hayes nodded grimly. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you have whatever you need. The question now is whether Nancy Rodriguez is ready to become a Marine sniper again." Within 20 minutes of Nancy's revelation, the Tactical Operations Center had been transformed into a military-style command post. Captain Hayes had authorized emergency procurement of specialized equipment. Federal databases had been accessed to retrieve Nancy's complete service record. and a precision rifle system had been requisitioned from the department's SWAT armory, though Nancy had immediately identified significant limitations in their standard-issue weapons that would compromise mission effectiveness. "The rifle you have available is adequate for conventional police sniper operations," Nancy explained to Sergeant Williams while examining the department's Remington 700 system, "but it's not optimized for the urban environment we're facing. The scope lacks the precision adjustment capabilities I need for complex atmospheric calculations, and the barrel isn't match-grade for the accuracy requirements this situation demands." Williams looked frustrated. "That's the best equipment we have. FBI tactical gear won't arrive for another 2 hours, and we don't have time to source custom hardware." Nancy considered the tactical problem while studying surveillance feeds that showed hostage positions throughout the Harbor View building. The suspects had distributed their captives across multiple floors, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that required simultaneous solutions rather than sequential tactical responses. "There's another option," she said quietly. "I have personal equipment that would be suitable for this mission." Captain Hayes looked up from his coordination with federal agencies. "What kind of personal equipment?" "My service rifle. M40A5 system. Custom modifications, match-grade barrel, precision optics calibrated to my specific shooting characteristics." Nancy paused, knowing that revealing the existence of her personal weapons cache would raise questions about her civilian identity. "It's at my apartment, maintained and ready for deployment." Detective Chen was coordinating with multiple tactical teams via secure communications. "Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant, we're running out of time. The suspects have moved hostages to windows on floors 22, 28, and 34. They're threatening to begin executions in 90 minutes if their media demands aren't met." Nancy moved to the tactical maps, her mind automatically calculating firing solutions for multiple target scenarios. The Harbor View building's position relative to surrounding structures created complex sightline challenges, but she could identify potential shooting positions that would provide the angles necessary for simultaneous precision engagements. "I need a tactical team to retrieve my equipment," she told Hayes, "and I need building access to the federal building observation deck. The height and angle will provide optimal positioning for multi-level engagement." Sergeant Williams was already dispatching officers to Nancy's apartment while she provided detailed descriptions of the equipment they would need to retrieve. But his expression remained skeptical about the tactical approach she was proposing. "Staff Sergeant, you're talking about precision shots at ranges exceeding 600 meters, through urban atmospheric conditions against multiple targets on different floors. Even with perfect equipment, the mathematical complexity is extraordinary." Nancy was studying wind measurements from the Harbor View area, analyzing atmospheric data that most marksmen would never consider relevant to urban shooting scenarios. "Sergeant, I've made confirmed kills at 1,200 meters under combat conditions. 600 meters in a controlled urban environment is well within my operational parameters." But even as she projected confidence, Nancy was wrestling with internal challenges that went far beyond tactical complexity. The last time she had engaged human targets through a rifle scope, the mission had ended with a traumatized child covered in blood. Now she was preparing to return to precision marksmanship in an environment where civilian casualties remained a constant risk. Detective Patterson approached with updated intelligence from FBI behavioral analysts. "The suspects aren't responding to negotiation attempts. Psychological profiles suggest they're committed to whatever endgame they've planned, regardless of law enforcement responses." Nancy absorbed this information while continuing her tactical analysis. Non-responsive subjects with professional equipment and training represented the most dangerous possible scenario. Operators who had accepted the likelihood of their own deaths in pursuit of objectives that remained unclear. "What's their operational timeline?" she asked. "Unknown," Patterson replied. "But intelligence suggests they're waiting for something, either additional support or optimal conditions for whatever they're really planning." As Nancy processed this information, her tactical instincts were identifying patterns in the suspect's behavior that extended beyond simple hostage-taking. Their positioning, their timing, their media demands, everything suggested a sophisticated operation designed to achieve objectives that hadn't yet become apparent. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying the urgent tone of someone who had identified a critical threat, "this isn't just about hostages. They're creating a spectacle that's drawing maximum law enforcement resources to a single location while maintaining positions that could support external operations." Hayes looked up from his communications with growing alarm. "External operations?" Think about it, Nancy continued, her analytical mind working through the tactical implications. They've got the entire department focused on Harbor View while they control sight lines that cover the federal courthouse, the financial district, and major transportation arteries. This could be Overwatch for something larger. Before Hayes could respond, Detective Chen's radio exploded with urgent traffic. All units, shots fired at the federal courthouse, multiple casualties reported, suspects appear to be engaging from elevated positions. Nancy felt her blood go cold as her tactical assessment proved accurate. The Harbor View situation had been preparation for a coordinated attack that was now unfolding across downtown Seattle. The hostage crisis was cover for sniper positions that could engage targets throughout the city center. "Staff Sergeant," Captain Hayes said, his voice tight with controlled urgency, "how quickly can you be operational?" Nancy was already calculating deployment timelines while monitoring radio traffic from the expanding crisis. 15 minutes to retrieve my equipment, 10 minutes to establish shooting position, 5 minutes to confirm range and atmospheric calculations. 30 minutes total. "Do it," Hayes ordered. "Full tactical authority. Whatever support you need. Whatever rules of engagement are necessary." As Nancy prepared to leave for her apartment, Sergeant Williams approached with obvious concern. "Staff Sergeant, you understand what you're committing to? If this goes wrong, if there are civilian casualties, the legal and political consequences will be enormous." Nancy met his gaze directly, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had faced similar decisions under combat conditions. "Sergeant, if I don't attempt this, people are going to die. If I do attempt it and fail, people might die. But if I don't try, the outcome is certain." The drive to her apartment took 12 minutes through Seattle traffic that had been disrupted by emergency response vehicles racing toward multiple crisis locations. Nancy used the time to center herself mentally, applying breathing techniques and visualization exercises that she hadn't used since leaving military service. Her personal rifle case was exactly where she had left it 3 years ago, sealed and maintained with religious precision despite her intention never to use it again. As she opened the case and assembled the M40A5 system, muscle memory took over with familiar efficiency. Every component was exactly as she remembered: the custom stock fitted to her specific anatomy, the match-grade barrel that had never disappointed her under pressure, the precision optics that had been calibrated through thousands of practice shots. But holding the rifle again brought back memories she had spent years trying to suppress, the weight of it across her shoulders during long observation missions, the absolute stillness required to remain hidden while tracking targets through complex terrain, the controlled breathing and heartbeat regulation that preceded every shot. The knowledge that her precision could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Nancy loaded the rifle with match-grade ammunition that she had maintained despite her civilian intentions, each round hand-selected for consistency and precision. As she checked the scope's calibration settings, she realized that she was no longer Nancy Rodriguez, the nervous evidence clerk. She was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Marine Corps Scout Sniper, preparing for a mission that would test every skill she had ever learned. The federal building's observation deck provided the elevated position Nancy needed, but the tactical challenges were immediately apparent. Harbor View stood 847 meters away, with urban wind patterns creating complex atmospheric conditions that would affect bullet trajectory. More challenging were the multiple target engagements required, suspects on 3 different floors, each requiring split-second timing to prevent hostage executions. Nancy established her shooting position with methodical precision, using techniques developed through years of training and combat experience. She calculated wind speed and direction using environmental indicators that most people would never notice. She measured temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure to determine their effects on bullet flight characteristics. She studied building geometry to identify optimal sight lines that would minimize exposure while maximizing effectiveness. But as she settled behind the rifle scope and began acquiring her first target, Nancy confronted the psychological challenge she had been dreading. Through the magnified optics, she could see not just armed suspects, but human beings whose lives she was about to end. And positioned near them were the innocent civilians whose safety depended on her precision. Her radio crackled with updates from the Tactical Operations Center. Sniper 1. Targets are moving toward hostage positions. Time to execution estimated at 6 minutes. Nancy controlled her breathing and began the mental process she had used countless times in combat zones, the deliberate suppression of emotion in favor of technical precision. She identified her primary target, calculated the necessary adjustments for atmospheric conditions, and began the steady pressure on her trigger that would determine the outcome of the crisis. But as she prepared to take the shot that would end the siege, Nancy realized that this moment represented more than tactical resolution. It was the convergence of everything she had been running from and everything she might become. A test of whether she could use her lethal skills to protect innocent life rather than simply eliminate enemy threats. The impossible shot she was about to attempt would determine not just the fate of the hostages, but the future of Nancy Rodriguez herself. Through the precision optics of her M40A5, Nancy could see every detail of the crisis unfolding 847 meters away. The primary suspect on the 22nd floor held a pistol to the head of a middle-aged woman in a business suit, while two additional armed figures maintained positions on floors 28 and 34 with their own hostages. The synchronized timing required for simultaneous neutralization was beyond the capabilities of any conventional sniper team, but Nancy Rodriguez was no longer bound by conventional limitations. Her radio crackled with urgent updates from the Tactical Operations Center. Sniper 1, subjects are demanding immediate media response. Estimated 30 seconds before they begin executions. Nancy controlled her breathing using techniques that had become automatic during her military service, slowing her heart rate to optimize the stability required for precision shooting. Through her scope, she could see the terror on the hostages' faces, the professional calm of the armed suspects, and the complex three-dimensional geometry that would determine success or failure. "Sniper 1 engaging," she transmitted, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with an impossible decision. Nancy's first shot struck the primary suspect's center mass at 847 meters, the precision of her marksmanship neutralizing the threat instantly while the hostage dove for cover behind concrete barriers. But there was no time to assess the outcome. The suspects on floors 28 and 34 would react within seconds, potentially executing their hostages before Nancy could reacquire and engage. She worked the bolt of her rifle with mechanical precision, chambering a second round while simultaneously tracking to her next target. The suspect on floor 28 was already responding to the sound of gunfire, but Nancy's scope found him before he could complete his movement toward his hostage. Her second shot eliminated the threat with surgical accuracy that left the civilian unharmed. The third engagement required a split-second calculation that tested every skill Nancy had ever developed. The suspect on floor 34 had heard the previous shots and was using his hostage as a human shield while moving toward a window that would provide him with sightlines to the street below. Nancy had less than 2 seconds to make a precision shot that would neutralize the threat without endangering the innocent person he was holding. She adjusted her aim point by millimeters, accounting for the suspect's movement, the hostage's position, and the complex ballistics required for a precision shot through the narrow gap between them. Her third shot struck the suspect in the head, ending the crisis without harming the civilian he had been using for protection. "Sniper 1, all targets neutralized," Nancy transmitted. "Hostages appear secure." The Tactical Operations Center erupted in relieved celebration, but Nancy remained focused on her scope, scanning for additional threats while SWAT teams moved into the Harbor View building to secure the scene. Her precision marksmanship had resolved the immediate crisis, but the broader implications of her actions were just beginning to unfold. Within minutes, federal tactical teams were confirming that the Harbor View threat had been completely neutralized. The 3 suspects were deceased, all hostages were safe, and the coordinated attack on downtown Seattle had been prevented through Nancy's intervention. But as she packed her rifle and prepared to return to the Tactical Operations Center, Nancy realized that her life had been irrevocably changed. Captain Hayes was waiting for her when she arrived back at the police station, his expression a mixture of professional gratitude and personal amazement. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, what you accomplished today, I've never seen precision marksmanship at that level. You saved dozens of lives." Nancy nodded, accepting the recognition while processing the emotional weight of returning to combat operations after 3 years of civilian life. "Captain, those shots were within my training parameters. Any qualified sniper could have achieved similar results." "No," Hayes replied firmly. "I've worked with military snipers, federal tactical teams, and elite law enforcement marksmen. What you did today, Simultaneous precision engagements at extended range under urban conditions. That's beyond conventional capabilities. That's artistry. As news of the crisis resolution spread through the department, Nancy found herself at the center of attention she had spent years avoiding. Officers who had barely acknowledged her existence as an evidence clerk now approached with obvious respect and professional curiosity. The transformation from nervous Nancy to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was complete and irreversible. Detective Patterson, who had spent 3 years dismissing her as an anxious civilian employee, approached with an expression of stunned disbelief. "Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. Hell, I owe you more than an apology. We all do." "No apology necessary," Nancy replied. "You saw exactly what I wanted you to see." The deception was deliberate. But even as she accepted the recognition of her colleagues, Nancy was struggling with the psychological implications of returning to precision marksmanship. The controlled violence that had ended the siege had also awakened aspects of her identity that she had tried to suppress since leaving military service. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the department's staff psychologist, appeared at Nancy's side as the immediate crisis debriefing concluded. "Staff Sergeant, I'd like to schedule some time to discuss your transition back to operational status. The psychological challenges of returning to sniper operations after extended civilian life are significant." Nancy appreciated the professional concern, but she also recognized that her relationship with precision marksmanship had fundamentally changed during the Harborview crisis. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm not returning to sniper operations. Today was an emergency response to save innocent lives. It doesn't change my decision to leave that life behind." But Captain Hayes had different ideas about Nancy's future role with the department. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I want to offer you a position with our tactical division. Lead sniper instructor, specialized weapons consultant, tactical planning advisor. We need someone with your expertise to prepare our department for threats we never imagined we'd face." The offer represented everything Nancy had been avoiding since leaving military service: responsibility for training others in lethal skills, involvement in tactical planning that could determine life and death outcomes, a return to the world of professional violence that had defined her military career. "Captain, I appreciate the offer, but I became an evidence clerk because I wanted distance from operational responsibilities. Today was an exception, not a career change." Hayes studied her with the calculating expression of someone who understood personnel management as well as tactical operations. "Staff Sergeant, with respect, you can't go back to being invisible. What happened today is going to be studied by law enforcement agencies nationwide. You've demonstrated capabilities that maybe a dozen people in the country possess. That's not something you can hide anymore." Nancy realized that Hayes was right. Her precision marksmanship during the Harborview crisis would become a case study in tactical problem-solving, analyzed and discussed by professional marksmen and law enforcement trainers across the country. The anonymity she had carefully constructed over 3 years had been permanently shattered. But as she considered her options, Nancy began to understand that her future didn't have to be defined by her past trauma or her current desire for anonymity. There was a third path, one that utilized her expertise while serving purposes that aligned with her values. "Captain, what if we approach this differently?" she said. "Not operational deployment, but training and consultation. Teaching other marksmen to solve impossible problems. Developing tactical approaches that minimize civilian casualties. Using my expertise to save lives rather than take them." The suggestion represented a compromise that addressed both the department's needs and Nancy's personal requirements. She could contribute her specialized knowledge while maintaining the psychological distance from direct violence that her mental health required. Over the following weeks, Nancy Rodriguez began to build a new identity that incorporated both her military expertise and her civilian values. She developed training programs that emphasized precision under pressure, tactical problem-solving in complex environments, and the ethical considerations that should guide any decision to use lethal force. Her first class of students included Sergeant Williams and several other SWAT officers who had witnessed her Harborview performance. But rather than focusing solely on marksmanship techniques, Nancy emphasized the decision-making processes that preceded any shot. "Precision marksmanship isn't about technical skills," she told her students during their first session. "It's about understanding when not to shoot. The most important shot a sniper ever takes is the one they choose not to fire." The training philosophy reflected Nancy's evolution from someone defined by her ability to eliminate targets to someone committed to preserving life through selective application of precision force. She had found a way to honor her military expertise while serving civilian values. 6 months after the Harborview crisis, Nancy Rodriguez had established herself as one of the country's leading experts in urban precision marksmanship and tactical consultation. Law enforcement agencies from across the nation sought her training and advice for complex operational scenarios. But she continued to live in the same Ballard apartment, drive the same modest car, and maintain the same preference for quiet professionalism that had characterized her evidence clerk years. The difference was that she no longer hid her expertise. She had learned to share it in ways that served protection rather than destruction. On quiet evenings, Nancy would sometimes take her M40A5 to private shooting ranges outside Seattle, practicing the precision techniques that kept her skills sharp while providing the meditative focus that had always been part of her relationship with marksmanship. But now the practice served preparation for saving lives rather than taking them. The transformation was complete. Nancy Rodriguez was no longer running from her identity as a Marine sniper. Nor was she trapped by it. She had become something new, a guardian whose precision served protection, a teacher whose expertise prevented tragedies, a professional whose skills were dedicated to preserving innocent life. They had called her Nervous Nancy when she was hiding from her true capabilities. Now they called her Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and when she made the impossible shot that ended the siege, she had also made the impossible transition from haunted veteran to purposeful protector. The evidence clerk who had spent 3 years cataloging weapons in anonymity had become the tactical consultant who trained others to use those weapons with the precision and judgment that could save lives when conventional solutions failed. Nancy Rodriguez had finally found her way home, not to her past but to her future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.